An abridgment of Thomas Manton's commentary on the Epistle of James chapter 3 verse 14. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition, translated strife, in the King James Version, in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. In this verse, James transitions to a new but closely related theme, the call to meekness in contrast to envy and selfish ambition. The apostle, having discussed the power of the tongue and the need for wisdom, now shifts to address the deeper issues that arise from envy and strife, issues that undermine the Christian community and distort godly wisdom. James begins with a rhetorical question: who is wise and understanding among you? He challenges those who would claim wisdom, urging them to demonstrate their wisdom through a life marked by good conduct and meekness. The apostle's approach is notable for its gentleness. Rather than offering harsh rebukes, he chooses to speak hypothetically. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, this indirect method of addressing potential faults is reminiscent of his earlier style in 125 and 215, where he offers correction without direct accusation. This reflects a pastoral heart, seeking to correct error with patience and grace, rather than condemnation. James understands that the Christian life is a process of growth, and in his exhortation, he provides an example of gentle reproof. He begins by identifying two of the primary opposites of godly wisdom: bitter envy and selfish ambition. These two attitudes are at the root of many of the evils that plague the Christian community, particularly those related to the misuse of the tongue. Bitter envy, James suggests, is often cloaked in the guise of zeal and righteousness, but at its core, it is destructive both to the individual and to others. The term bitter emphasizes the harmful nature of envy, which poisons relationships and sours the spirit. Unlike holy emulation, which seeks to grow in godliness by admiring others, bitter envy seeks to tear down those whom we perceive to be above us. James couples this with selfish ambition, a driving force that leads individuals to pursue personal glory at the expense of others. It is rooted in pride and a desire for recognition, causing strife and division within the community. He locates both of these sins in your hearts, reminding us that sin begins inwardly before it is manifested outwardly in our words and actions. As Jesus taught in Matthew 15 verse 19, out of the heart come evil thoughts. Therefore, James urges us to address these sins at their source, the heart, before they can corrupt our lives and relationships. The apostle continues, warning his readers not to boast about it or deny the truth. He critiques those who, despite harboring these sinful attitudes, continue to boast about their wisdom or zeal. This boasting is particularly insidious because it distorts the truth. Those who are envious or selfishly ambitious may claim to act out of righteous motives, but in reality, they are driven by pride. To boast about such behavior, James suggests, is to glory in your own shame rather than humbling oneself before God. He warns against such hypocrisy, reminding us that hypocrisy is a practical lie, as we claim to live according to the truth while allowing sin to fester in our hearts. We can deduce several key applications from this teaching. First, we should be reminded that envy is often the root of strife. Throughout Scripture, envy and strife are closely linked. In Romans 1 verse 29, Paul lists envy and strife together, and they appear in similar lists in 1 Corinthians 3 verse 3 and Galatians 5 verse 20. Envy was one of the sins that led to the crucifixion of Christ. Matthew 27 verse 18. Covetousness sold Christ for 30 pieces of silver, and envy delivered him to Pilate. These same sins continue to be enemies of true Christian profession, undermining our relationships with one another and distorting our witness to the world. James also highlights that selfish ambition, like envy, begins in the heart. Our external actions are merely the fruit of what has already taken root within us. As Proverbs 4 verse 23 instructs, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. If we wish to live lives free from envy and strife, we must first purify our hearts before God. It is from a heart transformed by grace that a life of godliness flows. Envious and contentious people, James says, have little reason to boast, for their behavior reveals the absence of grace or, at best, a weakness in their faith. Envy, as James explains, manifests in several ways. First, it reveals itself in grief at others' blessings or successes. Like Cain, who became despondent when God favored Abel's sacrifice, we may find ourselves resenting the good things that happen to others, even though their gain does not diminish our own. Envy also shows itself in rejoicing at others' failures or misfortunes, a direct violation of the call to love our neighbors as ourselves. Finally, envy leads to a lack of generosity, a desire to keep everything for oneself and resent the blessings given to others. In contrast, Moses exhibited a spirit of generosity, desiring that all of God's people would be prophets. Numbers 11:29. James warns that envy and strife are often disguised as zeal for God. It is easy to justify selfish ambition and bitter envy under the guise of religious fervor. In 1 Corinthians 1 verse 12, Paul rebukes those who claim to follow Christ, but were in fact causing division. Even the best religious cause can be tainted by sinful motives. James urges us to examine our hearts carefully, for what may appear to be zeal may, in fact, be rooted in pride or selfishness. As in the case of Jehu in 2 Kings 10 verse 16, a proclamation of zeal for the Lord may actually be nothing more than a pretense for self-promotion. Finally, James reminds us that hypocrisy is one of the worst forms of lying. To live a life that professes one thing while practicing another is to deceive not only others but ourselves. Hypocrisy, he warns, is akin to blasphemy because it brings dishonor to the name of God. Revelation 2 verse 9 describes those who say they are Jews and are not as engaging in slander or blasphemy. In the same way, when Christians claim to follow Christ while harboring envy and selfish ambition, they misrepresent the truth of the gospel and bring dishonor to God's name. In conclusion, James calls us to pursue true wisdom, which is marked by humility, meekness, and purity of heart. Envy and selfish ambition are destructive forces that must be rooted out of our hearts if we are to live lives that honor God. Our actions must flow from a heart transformed by the grace of Christ, and we must guard against the hypocrisy that comes from professing one thing while living another. True wisdom is demonstrated not in boasting or self-promotion, but in a life lived in humility, service, and love for others. Let us, therefore, strive for the wisdom that comes from above, which is first of all pure. Then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. James 3 verse 17.